others felt James was being treated unfairly. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to defend James while also attempting to keep the peace. In the midst of all the chaos, I asked Emily why she didn't ask Tom to help pay for the wedding, especially since he was suddenly so important to her. I thought it was a fair question, especially given that Tom had become such a big part of the wedding plans. Emily told me she had asked, but he said he didn't have any money saved for something like that. After much thought, James made the tough decision to step back completely. He decided that he couldn't remain involved in the wedding, either emotionally or financially. It was his way of protecting himself from more pain and making a statement about how deeply he had been hurt. It wasn't an easy choice, but he felt it was the only way to preserve his dignity and sanity. The impact of James' decision was immediate and enormous. Without his financial support, the wedding preparations turned into chaos. Emily had been counting on James' contributions to cover a significant portion of the costs. Now, with that funding gone, she was forced to figure out how to make up the difference. In the end, Emily had to scale back the wedding significantly. The beautiful venue she had dreamed of was the first thing to go. She had to settle for a much simpler location. Some things had already been paid for, like her dress, so at least that remained intact. In the midst of the chaos, as the wedding day approached, it became clear that James and I wouldn't be attending. A few days after the wedding, Emily called us. That conversation was one of the hardest I've ever had. She told us that we had ruined her wedding by pulling our support. Now, some of our relatives are siding with Emily, saying we should have gone along with what she wanted to keep the peace. They believe James and I overreacted and that family should always come first, no matter the circumstances. It's hard to feel misunderstood and unsupported by people who should know the full story. I'm posting this on Reddit because I need an impartial opinion. Am I in the right here, or should we have paid for the wedding? Update 1. Thank you for taking the time to comment. After reading your opinions, I really believe we did the right thing. A few months have passed since the wedding, and I wish I could say things have improved, but unfortunately, they haven't. Emily still isn't speaking to James or me. It's as if she has completely erased us from her life, and honestly, it's heartbreaking. I've tried reaching out to her several times, hoping we could have a calm conversation and work things out, but she doesn't want to hear anything from us. To be frank, Emily is acting like a spoiled child. I know that sounds harsh, but I'm at my wit's end. She's behaving like a brat who didn't get her way, and instead of trying to understand our perspective, she's clinging to her stance and refusing to acknowledge how much she's hurt James. Every time I think about it, I feel a mix of sadness and frustration. I understand that reconnecting with her biological father was important to Emily, but I can't comprehend how she's so quickly disregarded everything James has done for her. It's like she's forgotten all the sacrifices he made, all the times he was there for her when Tom wasn't even in the picture. And now, because she didn't get what she wanted, she's throwing a tantrum and cutting us out of her life. What's even more frustrating is how she's playing the victim to anyone who will listen. I've heard from some family members that Emily has been spreading her version of the story, and it's clearly biased. Some of our relatives are even starting to believe her side, which only complicates things further. I feel like I'm constantly defending James and myself, trying to set the record straight, but Emily's influence seems stronger than the truth at this point. I didn't want to believe that Emily could be so selfish, but here we are. She's always been a bit stubborn, but this level of entitlement is something completely new. It's like she expects the world to revolve around her, and when it doesn't, she gets angry and refuses to take responsibility for her actions. Sorry for venting, but I've never been this frustrated before, and this has given me an outlet to release all my feelings. Update 2. It's been a few months since my last update, and things have taken a rather unexpected turn. I'm not sure how to feel about what's happening, so I thought I'd come here for some advice. Last weekend, Emily showed up at our house unexpectedly. Honestly, I didn't know what to expect since she's been so distant and cold since the wedding. When she appeared at the door, I was shocked, but I let her in because, well, she's still my daughter despite everything that's happened. After we sat down, Emily told me that she and Mark are in serious financial trouble. Apparently, she went way over budget for the wedding, maxed out her credit cards, and now has debt collectors calling her constantly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We all knew the wedding was expensive, even after they had to cut some things, but I had no idea she had stretched herself so thin. I asked her how on earth she could let this happen, especially knowing what her financial limits were. That's when she dropped the bombshell. It was our fault. She had been counting on our help for the wedding, and when we withdrew our support, we left her in a desperate situation. My jaw practically hit the floor. Our fault? After everything that had happened? After she pushed James aside and said those awful things about him? It took everything in me not to lose my temper right then and there. James wasn't home at the time, so it was just the two of us. I took a deep breath and asked her, "Why don't you ask your beloved dad Tom for help?" I know it was a bit sarcastic, but I couldn't help it. She looked down and told me she already had, and surprise, surprise, Tom refused. I shouldn't have been surprised. A part of me saw this coming a mile away. She then started pleading, saying she had nowhere else to turn, and even offering that it would be a small loan that she would pay back. I could see the desperation in her eyes, and it broke my heart a little. Despite everything, she's still my child, and seeing her like this was hard. But at the same time, I couldn't just forget what had happened. I told her that a lot had happened, especially with her accusations, and that I needed time to think about it. She seemed disappointed but accepted it and left. Now I'm in this horrible position where I have to decide what to do next. Part of me is afraid to tell James. I know he'd jump at the chance to help Emily because not contributing to her wedding has been eating him up. Even though he withdrew, I know it's been hard for him, and I can see he's still hurting over the whole thing. But another part of me feels that helping Emily now would only be enabling her behavior. She needs to understand that actions have consequences. She can't just come running to us every time she's in trouble, especially after the way she treated us. What do you think? Should I tell James about Emily's request? Should we help her, or is it time for some tough love? Any advice or perspective would be really helpful right now. Thanks in advance. Update 3. I wanted to share with you what's happened recently, as I didn't see this coming at all. After my last update, I spent a lot of time thinking about Emily's request and how to handle the situation. I knew I had to talk to James about Emily's visit and her plea for money, but I also knew it was going to be a difficult conversation. James has been incredibly strong and patient throughout all of this, but the wounds Emily inflicted are still fresh, and I wasn't sure how he would react. Finally, one night after dinner, I gathered the courage to tell James about Emily's visit and her request for money. To be honest, I was worried about how he'd take it, especially because I know how much he loves Emily, despite everything that's happened. As I spoke, I watched his face, waiting to see that spark of concern and paternal love that he always has when it comes to her. However, what I saw this time was different. James remained silent, taking in everything I told him. Then, in a calm voice, he said something I didn't expect. "I can't do it." I was quiet for a moment, then reacted. "What do you mean you can't do it?" James, with a bit of sadness, told me there's only so much pain a father can endure. Even though I'm not her biological father, I've always seen her as my daughter. But now, after everything that's happened, I just can't give her the money. I can't keep being the emotional and financial backup while she continues to push me aside and treat me like a stranger in her life. This has been too painful, and I'm not sure how much more I can take. I felt a lump in my throat as I listened to James. I knew how much this was costing him emotionally, and seeing him reach this point of exhaustion confirmed how much he had been suffering because of this. He wasn't being cruel or vindictive, he was just protecting himself from more hurt. The next day, after thinking it over, I called Emily to give her the news. Before I told her, I asked how much money she needed to get out of debt. The amount she mentioned took my breath away, $35,000. That's not a small sum, and considering that a lot of her debt was due to luxury expenses, I told her, I talked to James, and we're not going to be able to lend you the money. This isn't easy for us, but there are limits to what we can bear, especially after everything that's happened. It's not that we don't want to help you, but he's deeply hurt, and we can't ignore that." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Emily asked, with a tone of desperation, "What am I supposed to do now? Tom's not exactly in my life right now." I asked her what she meant by that, and after a moment of hesitation, Emily explained that since she had asked Tom for financial help, he had been avoiding her calls. He barely responded to her messages and had generally disappeared from her life once again. The fact that Tom wasn't living up to Emily's expectations didn't surprise me in the least. After all, he had been absent for most of her life, and now that things were difficult, it seemed like he had reverted to his old behavior patterns. Emily tried to justify it, saying maybe he was busy or didn't know how to handle the situation, but to me, it was clear that Tom wasn't the support she hoped he would be. It's ironic, really. Now, not only will she have a massive debt hanging over her head that will make her wedding memories negative, but she'll probably have plenty of photos from her wedding with her biological father, who abandoned her again. If that's not karma, I don't know what is. Update 4. I have an update about my life and Emily, so I'm back. After 3 months, I'm only writing this because of what happened a few days ago. It was a quiet afternoon at home. James and I were preparing dinner when we heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. We weren't expecting anyone, so neither of us made any move to answer the door at first. Eventually, James went to check. When he opened the door, what I saw was completely unexpected. There stood Emily on the doorstep. Behind her, her car was packed with suitcases and boxes, as if she had hurriedly packed up her entire life and stuffed it into her vehicle. James looked at her, surprised, but before he could say anything, Emily looked him directly in the eye and asked if she could stay at our house. I walked over to the door, sensing that something serious was going on. "What happened, Emily?" I asked, trying to understand the situation. Emily sighed deeply and looked down before responding. "I had a fight with Mark," she began. "Things have been really tough between us, especially with all the money issues. I just couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to leave the house. I don't want to be there right now." That's when James made a decision. He told Emily, "You can't stay here." Then he turned around and headed back into the kitchen without saying another word. I swear, I have never seen him look so hurt in my life. Emily stood there, shocked by James' response. I stayed at the door with her, watching as her eyes filled with tears. I knew I had to say something, so with as much calm as I could muster, I explained, "Emily, I know this is hard, but James has made it clear that you can't stay here, and I respect his decision." Emily looked at me with a mix of desperation and surprise. "Mom, you don't have to listen to James. He's not even my biological father, but I'm your daughter. You should let me stay," she said, trying to appeal to our biological connection as if that should carry more weight in this moment. But the truth is, regardless of that, too much had changed. "Emily," I responded firmly, "regardless of whether it's James' decision, I also think it's not a good idea for you to stay here. There's too much pain and too many unresolved things. I don't think it's what's best for any of us right now." She tried to push further, begging me to let her stay, but I stood my ground. I knew I had to be firm for the sake of all of us. Without saying much more, Emily turned, got back into her car, and drove away. This has been one of the hardest moments we've had to face as a family, but I also know it was necessary. The wounds that have been left between us can't be healed overnight, and while it hurts to make these decisions, I know that sometimes it's the only way to protect yourself and others. I haven't heard from her since, so I assume she's found another place to stay or gone back to Mark. It's tough as a mother, but I believe it was something that had to be done. I've talked to James, and we both agree that just because she's in trouble doesn't mean we're going to forget everything. I wish we hadn't reached this point, but sometimes life is more complicated than we'd like it